What if one miscalculation could doom 500,000 soldiers before they ever understood the trap closing around them? In the summer of 1941, entire Soviet armies vanished inside an encirclement so vast that even commanders could not trace the edges of their own front. This is the story of how Ukraine became the site of the Red Army's first great destruction, and why no one saw it coming until it was too late. The events that led to the destruction of major Red Army formations in Ukraine began long before the first clashes of June 1941. After the German occupation of Poland in 1939 and the Soviet annexation of eastern Poland under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the new border between Germany and the USSR shifted hundreds of kilometers eastward. This produced a frontier that was difficult to defend. Soviet fortifications of the former Stalin Line were partially dismantled, while the newer Molotov Line remained incomplete by June 1941. Many bunkers lacked artillery, communication wiring, and permanent garrisons. Soviet planners estimated that full readiness of the line would require at least 2 additional years. Throughout 1940-1941, Soviet intelligence reported growing German troop concentrations in occupied Poland and Romania. Reports indicated the presence of more than 100 German divisions near the border by early June 1941. However, the Soviet General Staff assumed that if war began, Germany would follow a strategy similar to the First World War, prioritizing a main attack in the center toward Moscow. This belief shaped deployment. The Southwestern Front in Ukraine received large forces, over 900,000 personnel, around 12,000 artillery pieces, and more than 4,000 tanks, but these formations were positioned too close to the frontier, with limited operational depth and weak logistical infrastructure. German planning for Operation Barbarossa assigned Army Group South the task of destroying Soviet forces in Ukraine. It fielded approximately 625,000 soldiers, 9,100 artillery pieces, and around 1,000 tanks, with Romanian forces adding more than 325,000 troops and several hundred armored vehicles. The group aimed to advance toward Kiev, Dnipro crossings, and the industrial Donbass region. German intelligence underestimated Soviet strength, assessing about 120 Soviet divisions on the entire Soviet western frontier, whereas the USSR deployed over 170. The political context further complicated Soviet readiness. After the Soviet annexation of Bessarabia and Bukovina in 1940, Romania joined the Axis, and Germany established significant oil interests around Ploiești. Germany planned to secure these resources by pushing deep into southern USSR territory. The Soviet leadership, however, prioritized avoiding actions that could provoke conflict and therefore restricted frontline commanders from taking full defensive measures. Camouflage, dispersal of aircraft, and mobilization steps were often delayed or forbidden until mid-June 1941. Public sentiment in the USSR was shaped by state media assurances that Germany respected the non-aggression pact. Despite growing military activity near the frontier, no official warnings were issued to the population. Reservists were only partially mobilized, and many units lacked full complements of trained personnel. Ammunition stocks were distributed unevenly, with some depots located dangerously close to the border. Fuel supply networks for mechanized corps were insufficient for extended operations. By the eve of the invasion, Soviet mechanized corps in Ukraine possessed impressive numbers on paper. Several corps had more than 1,000 tanks each. Yet many vehicles required repairs, and crews were undertrained, with some corps only recently formed. German panzer divisions, though smaller at around 150-200 tanks each, had cohesive command systems, integrated air-ground coordination, and experienced personnel from previous campaigns. Diplomatically, Germany attempted to maintain the illusion of peaceful intentions until the last days. Deliveries of raw materials under the Soviet-German economic agreements continued. At the same time, German field commanders received final orders for the attack scheduled for 22 June 1941. By that date, the Wehrmacht had completed deployment along a 1,600-kilometer front. Thus, on the eve of the operation, Ukraine became a region where large Soviet concentrations defended poorly prepared fortifications, where command expected a central rather than a southern main thrust, and where logistical weaknesses limited operational flexibility. These preconditions created the framework within which the following months would result in one of the earliest and most severe encirclements faced by the Red Army in 1941. When German forces crossed the Soviet border on 22 June 1941, the southwestern front in Ukraine received confirmation of the attack only minutes after Luftwaffe aircraft began striking airfields, command posts, and communication hubs. Within the first hours, more than 200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground across the Kiev, Odessa, and Lviv military districts. The destruction of runways, telephone lines, and radio stations disrupted the ability of front headquarters to coordinate its armies. Commanders attempted to re-establish control through courier communication, which slowed the transmission of orders during the critical opening phase. Army Group South initiated its advance with the 1st Panzer Group, the 6th Army, the 17th Army, and Romanian units pushing forward along a broad front. The 1st Panzer Group, fielding approximately 800 operational tanks, led the breakthrough against Soviet forward positions in Volhynia. German infantry divisions followed with methodical movements aimed at widening the breach and preventing Soviet counter-concentration. By the end of the first day, German formations had advanced up to 20 kilometers in multiple sectors, overrunning incomplete defensive positions along the new frontier line. Soviet command responded with an immediate order to launch a counteroffensive. Mechanized corps from the 5th and 6th Armies were directed toward the German spearheads near Lutsk and Dubno. However, these formations faced difficulty assembling. The 22nd Mechanized Corps, which had around 700 tanks on paper, reported fewer than 500 ready for immediate action, and many units were positioned more than 100 kilometers from their designated concentration areas. Fuel shortages forced some divisions to abandon vehicles during the march. Communications between Corps headquarters and the front command remained inconsistent. Within the first 48 hours, German forces seized key bridgeheads across the Steyr and Horen rivers, enabling rapid reinforcement of the armored thrust. The Luftwaffe maintained air superiority, flying hundreds of sorties daily to disrupt Soviet movements. Soviet attempts to relocate aircraft deeper into Ukraine reduced further losses, but limited the ability to provide tactical support to ground units. Despite high numbers of aircraft in the region, over 3,500 at the outbreak, serviceability and dispersal issues restricted operational effectiveness. By 24 June, the front situation revealed the scale of the crisis. Soviet armies deployed along the border, particularly the 5th, 6th, and 26th Armies, found their defensive sectors penetrated in several locations. Local commanders attempted to form new defensive lines around Rivne, Lutsk, and Brody, but the speed of German armored movements outpaced the redeployment of infantry and artillery. Many regiments moved without full ammunition loads, having been cut off from depots near the frontier. The Southwestern Front headquarters, led by General Mikhail Kirponos, attempted to stabilize the situation through coordinated counterattacks. Orders issued on 23 to 25 June demanded the commitment of multiple mechanized corps into the Lutsk-Dubno area to halt the German advance. These corps collectively fielded more than 2,500 tanks, including T-34s and KV-1s, but the operational difficulties accumulated during the first days prevented synchronized strikes. Some divisions received attack orders while still engaged in marches, resulting in fragmented assaults. German command recognized the developing counteroffensive and committed additional infantry divisions to secure the flanks of the 1st Panzer Group. Although surprised by the scale of Soviet armored forces, German formations exploited their superior coordination, concentrated firepower, and uninterrupted logistical flow. The initial Soviet attempts to restore the front line produced localized clashes, but failed to stop the momentum of the advance. By the end of the opening phase, the Wehrmacht had established a deep penetration more than 60 kilometers into Soviet-held territory in several sectors. The Southwestern Front faced the task of redirecting large formations under conditions of deteriorating communication, disrupted supply routes, and continuous air pressure. The early hours and days of the invasion set in motion the sequence of operations that would lead to the encirclement battles in Ukraine and the extensive destruction of Red Army forces in the coming weeks. Soviet and German strategic planning in the days following the initial breakthrough revealed contrasting approaches shaped by doctrine, intelligence assessments, and expectations about the direction of the campaign. Soviet High Command, the Stavka, believed that the German main effort would remain focused on the central axis toward Moscow, and therefore sought to prevent a deep envelopment in Ukraine by committing extensive mechanized formations to counter the 1st Panzer Group. On 25 to 27 June, the Southwestern Front received orders to launch coordinated counterattacks involving the 4th, 8th, 9th, 15th, 19th, and 22nd Mechanized Corps, together fielding more than 3,000 tanks. However, these formations were spread across a zone more than 300 kilometers wide, lacked unified command, and were required to move toward a barely understood and rapidly shifting battlefield. Logistical realities shaped the strategic outlook. Mechanized Corps required up to 300 tons of fuel per day for sustained operations, yet many of their supply depots were located near the border and had been overrun or forced to relocate. Ammunition trains were rerouted, delayed, or destroyed by airstrikes. Communications between front headquarters and Mechanized Corps often relied on motorcycle couriers, creating delays of several hours. The mismatch between planned maneuver and actual operational capability meant that Soviet armored concentration developed more slowly than anticipated. At the same time, German planners benefited from established supply corridors across formerly Polish territories, enabling relatively consistent delivery of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to forward units. German strategic goals in Ukraine were defined in Directive 21. Destroy Soviet forces west of the Dnipro River, secure Kiev, and then advance toward the industrial regions of eastern Ukraine. The 1st Panzer Group, commanded by General Ewald von Kleist, served as the primary mobile force assigned to achieve the breakthrough. Although it possessed only around 800 operational tanks, less than a third of the Soviet total in the region, its organization emphasized rapid encirclement operations, close air support, and flexible task group formations. The German command principle of Auftragstaktik allowed divisional commanders to adjust movements without constant reference to higher headquarters, enabling faster reactions to Soviet counteractions. Propaganda on both sides framed the conflict in starkly different terms. Soviet state broadcasts described the invasion as a treacherous assault, urging the population to resist and mobilize for a prolonged struggle. German communications emphasized rapid victory, portraying the Soviet Union as militarily inferior despite available intelligence showing significant Soviet numerical strength. These narratives influenced morale. While Soviet troops demonstrated determination, many remained uncertain about the overall strategic situation due to disrupted communication lines. German soldiers, conditioned by victories in France and the Balkans, expected swift operational success, but encountered unexpectedly large Soviet armored reserves. Miscalculations became central to the unfolding campaign. Soviet planners assumed that the mass deployment of Mechanized Corps could deliver a decisive counterstroke, yet failed to account for the Corps' low readiness levels, recent reorganization, and lack of joint training. German planners underestimated both the depth of Soviet reserves and the capacity of Soviet units to reform defensive positions after initial setbacks. This contributed to the intensity of the fighting near Lutsk, Dubno, and Brody, where both sides committed substantial forces within a short period. Terrain also shaped planning. Northwestern Ukraine featured dense forests, river crossings, and limited road networks. German armored units concentrated on the main highway corridors, enabling faster movement, while Soviet units were often forced to maneuver along secondary roads that deteriorated under heavy traffic. This slowed the assembly of Soviet formations and produced traffic congestion extending tens of kilometers. In several mechanized corps, fuel trucks became separated from tank regiments, reducing combat readiness. Both sides recognized the strategic importance of Kiev. Soviet leadership sought to preserve the capital and prevent an operational collapse of the Southwestern Front. German strategy aimed at isolating the city through a rapid advance, preventing Soviet armies from withdrawing behind the Dnipro. These opposing objectives increased the likelihood of an encirclement operation, as the Soviet command insisted on holding forward positions despite mounting evidence of deep penetrations along the flanks. By the final days of June, the planning stage had transitioned into a phase of continuous movement. German forces pushed eastward, adjusting plans to exploit weaknesses identified in Soviet formations. The Soviet command, constrained by incomplete information and limited operational flexibility, prepared to launch its mechanized counteroffensive in the hope of halting the advance. Strategic decisions made during this period set the conditions for the massive engagements that would follow, as both armies prepared to commit large formations into one of the largest armored battles of the early war. The first major engagements between the advancing German spearheads and the Soviet mechanized counteroffensive began on 26-29 June 1941 across a wide arc stretching from Lutsk to Dubno and Brody. This zone became the site of one of the largest armored clashes of the initial campaign, involving more than 700 German tanks and over 2,500 Soviet tanks committed piecemeal over several days. The battles emerged not from a single coordinated operation, but from a series of meeting engagements, as Soviet corps attempted to reach their assigned concentration areas, while German panzer divisions continued advancing toward Rivne and Berdichev. The 15th Mechanized Corps engaged first. Its lead elements encountered the 11th Panzer Division near Lutsk, resulting in heavy fighting around the Styr River crossings. Soviet forces fielded hundreds of T-26 and BT series tanks, supported by a smaller number of T-34s and KV-1s. Although the heavier Soviet vehicles demonstrated strong armor protection, many arrived without sufficient fuel or ammunition. The German division maintained cohesive formations and concentrated anti-tank guns, 37mm and 50mm pieces, along narrow corridors, inflicting significant losses on lighter Soviet tanks attempting to break through. Further south, the 8th and 9th Mechanized Corps attempted to strike the flanks of the 1st Panzer Group near Brody. These corps possessed some of the most modern tanks available in the region, including over 200 T-34s and KV-1s. However, their attacks developed under challenging conditions. Soviet units were forced to march overnight across distances exceeding 100 kilometers, with some regiments arriving with only a fraction of their vehicles operational. Road congestion slowed progress, and Luftwaffe airstrikes targeted columns moving in daylight. As a result, several divisions entered battle sequentially rather than in a unified assault. At Dubno, the 19th and 22nd Mechanized Corps confronted the 13th Panzer Division and elements of the 16th Panzer Division. Intense fighting erupted in villages such as Pustomaidi, Horokhiv, and Verba, where Soviet armored units attempted to cut German supply lines. The terrain, featuring marshy areas, tight village streets, and limited maneuver space, restricted armored operations. German forces used combined infantry tank tactics to hold key junctions, while Soviet tank brigades pushed repeatedly to disrupt the panzer advance. In several instances, Soviet heavy tanks broke through German lines, but the absence of infantry and artillery support limited the depth of these penetrations. Civilian populations in the region experienced immediate consequences. Villages near the front changed hands multiple times within days, forcing residents to flee or shelter in basements. Agricultural areas were damaged by tank movements and artillery fire. Railway lines, essential for evacuation and supply, were frequently cut or disabled. The rapid movement of forces produced uncertainty, with local administrations receiving conflicting information about the direction of the fighting. Morale on both sides fluctuated. German units were surprised by the resilience and scale of Soviet armored forces, which contradicted pre-war intelligence estimates. Reports from panzer divisions noted engagements with tanks that their anti-tank guns could not reliably penetrate at standard combat ranges. Conversely, Soviet units faced the challenge of coordinating inexperienced crews, insufficient supplies, and the lack of updated tactical instructions. The shock of the initial invasion, combined with disrupted communication, limited unified action. By 28 June, the battles reached a turning point. Despite localized Soviet successes, such as temporary breakthroughs near Dubno and the destruction of several dozen German tanks, the counteroffensive lacked the massed coordination necessary to halt the 1st Panzer Group. German units maintained momentum by rapidly regrouping and directing reserves to threatened sectors. Air support remained consistent, with Stuka dive bombers targeting Soviet columns attempting to maneuver into position. Fuel deficiencies continued to affect Soviet mechanized corps, with some regiments reporting less than 20% of required supplies. Territorial shifts reflected the evolving situation. German forces advanced eastward toward Rivne and southward toward Brody and Zolochev. Soviet attempts to establish defensive lines along the Ikva and Horan rivers were undermined by incomplete engineering preparations and the rapid arrival of German forward units. While Soviet troops held several strongpoints for extended periods, the overall line continued to bend under pressure. By the end of June, the first phase of major engagements had concluded. The Soviet mechanized counteroffensive failed to deliver a decisive blow, though it temporarily slowed the German advance in certain areas. The Wehrmacht retained the operational initiative, with the 1st Panzer Group preparing to exploit its gains and deepen the penetration into Soviet territory. The Southwestern Front, having committed much of its armored strength, now faced the challenge of reorganizing under increasingly difficult conditions. As the first week of the campaign ended, the conflict in Ukraine entered a phase of escalation marked by intensified German pressure and growing operational strain on the Red Army. Between 30 June and 6 July, Army Group South sought to widen and deepen its advance toward Kiev, Vinnytsia, and the Dnipro crossings, while Soviet forces attempted to rebuild defensive lines after the partial failure of the mechanized counteroffensive. The Southwestern Front faced increasing challenges stemming from disrupted command structures, shortages of fuel and ammunition, and the cumulative effects of earlier losses in vehicles, artillery, and communications equipment. German forces concentrated on consolidating the gains achieved by the 1st Panzer Group. The panzer divisions advanced along the Rivne-Zhytomyr axis, capturing strategic junctions that allowed them to threaten the rear of the Soviet 5th and 6th Armies. Infantry divisions of the 6th Army followed, securing captured territory and preventing Soviet formations from establishing stable defensive positions. Luftwaffe operations intensified during this period, with hundreds of sorties targeting retreating Soviet units, river crossings, headquarters, and ammunition trains. The continued loss of transport vehicles significantly impaired Soviet mobility. Soviet attempts to deploy reserves encountered major obstacles. The 37th Army, forming near Kiev, lacked full equipment and had incomplete training cycles. Reinforcements from the interior, rifle divisions mobilized in late June, required several days to reach the front and often arrived without heavy weapons or sufficient artillery support. The Stavka ordered the Southwestern Front to hold the line west of Kiev, yet commanders faced increasing uncertainty regarding the positions of their own units due to broken communication lines. Some divisions reported only fragmentary information about their regiments, which had become separated during retreats or forced marches. Terrain and weather contributed to the operational difficulties. Heavy rains in early July turned unpaved roads into mud, slowing the movement of both sides but affecting Soviet retreating columns more severely. Vehicles with mechanical issues were abandoned, and artillery batteries unable to reposition quickly became vulnerable to encirclement. German engineers worked continuously to repair bridges and create bypasses, enabling the Panzer Group to maintain operational tempo despite the deteriorating road conditions. Soviet engineering units attempted to demolish bridges across the Horan and Sluch rivers, but many demolitions were carried out under pressure, resulting in incomplete destruction or insufficient delay of advancing forces. Political tensions grew within the Soviet leadership as the scale of the crisis became clearer. Reports reaching Moscow indicated that several armies of the Western Front had already collapsed after encirclement near Białystok and Minsk. The Southwestern Front had not suffered a similar disaster yet, but the risk increased daily as German spearheads continued to penetrate between army boundaries. The Soviet command insisted on maintaining forward positions to protect Kiev and prevent a deeper strategic collapse, although these directives left several armies at risk of isolation. Casualties rose sharply on both sides. German reports from early July listed several thousand personnel losses and the destruction or disabling of dozens of armored vehicles, mainly due to engagements with Soviet heavy tanks and anti-tank artillery. Soviet losses, however, expanded at a faster rate. Many rifle divisions lost more than 30% of their personnel during the first 2 weeks, and Mechanized Corps reported that fewer than half of their original tanks remained operational. Hospitals in Zhytomyr, Rivne, and Shepetivka struggled to handle the influx of wounded, while evacuation trains were frequently delayed or hit by air raids. The civilian impact intensified as front lines continued to shift. Rail traffic became increasingly chaotic, with passenger trains and military transports competing for limited track capacity. Cities such as Rivne and Berdichev experienced shortages of food, medicine, and housing due to the rapid movement of troops and refugees. Local administrations attempted evacuation procedures for critical infrastructure workers, but many plans could not be fully executed due to the speed of German advances. On the German side, challenges emerged in maintaining supply lines across the expanding front. Fuel convoys traveled long distances along roads congested with advancing units, captured Soviet vehicles, and logistical columns. The pace of advance strained maintenance units, which struggled to repair tanks damaged in earlier battles. Despite these difficulties, German operational cohesion remained intact, allowing further exploitation of openings created by the faltering Soviet defensive line. By early July, the crisis for the Southwestern Front reached a new stage. Although Soviet units continued to resist, their ability to hold continuous defensive fronts diminished. Commanders attempted to regroup along the line, extending from Korostin to Berdichev, yet German forces approached these sectors rapidly. The overall situation pointed toward an expanding operational rupture that, unless reversed, could lead to the isolation of entire Soviet armies in the coming weeks. During the first half of July 1941, the campaign in Ukraine reached its operational peak as German forces intensified efforts to encircle major Red Army formations west of the Dnipro. The 1st Panzer Group continued to advance along two principal axes, one toward Zhytomyr and the approaches to Kiev, and another toward Berdichev and Vinnytsia. Infantry armies, particularly the 6th and 17th Armies, followed to consolidate territorial gains and secure the flanks of the armored spearheads. This combination of rapid penetration and methodical infantry support created growing pressure on the Soviet 5th, 6th, and 26th Armies, which were increasingly at risk of being cut off from the rest of the Southwestern Front. The largest operations unfolded along the Kiev-Zhytomyr corridor. German armored divisions captured Zhytomyr on 9 July, gaining a significant communications hub that enabled the coordination of forward movements. With control of the city's railway network, German command improved its logistical flows and shortened supply routes to the front. Luftwaffe units intensified activity over the region, targeting Soviet withdrawal routes, bridges across the Irpin and Tatarov rivers, and known troop concentrations. Continuous air pressure complicated Soviet attempts to reposition artillery and reserves, while damaged infrastructure slowed the movement of retreating units. Soviet forces attempted to mount organized resistance. The 5th Army, positioned north of Zhytomyr, established defensive points along the forested areas near Korostin and Novorad-Volinsky. Rifle divisions used natural terrain features, including marshlands and river bends, to strengthen defensive positions. However, the Army's left flank remained exposed as the German advance approached the Kiev fortified region. The 6th Army, deployed south of Zhytomyr, attempted to construct a defensive arc between Berdichev and Vinnytsia, but German forces captured several key junctions before these positions could be reinforced. The inability to synchronize withdrawals between neighboring armies allowed German units to penetrate gaps between sectors. The intensity of combat increased around Berdichev, where the 11th and 16th Panzer Divisions sought to outflank the Soviet 6th Army. Soviet formations launched repeated counterattacks using remnants of their mechanized corps, committing dozens of T-34s, KV-1s, and lighter tanks to blunt the advance. Although individual engagements resulted in destroyed German vehicles and temporary stabilization of certain sectors, The overall operational balance favored the side with consistent supply and intact communications. Soviet armored units, having lost a substantial portion of their vehicles in June, operated with limited fuel reserves and dwindling ammunition stocks. Civilian suffering intensified as urban centers became battlegrounds. Artillery exchanges damaged residential districts in Zhytomyr, Berdyshev, and smaller towns along the axis of advance. Evacuation orders were issued for industrial facilities, but many factories lacked adequate transport to relocate machinery. Workers' columns attempting evacuation were often redirected multiple times due to changing front lines. Hospitals operated beyond capacity, and medical supplies diminished rapidly. Railway lines eastward became congested with both military trains and civilian evacuations, slowing the redeployment of reserves from central Ukraine. German command decisions during this period aimed to convert local gains into a large-scale operational encirclement. With panzer divisions holding key positions east of Zhytomyr and advancing steadily toward the Dnipro crossings, the prospect of isolating Soviet armies west of Kiev became increasingly realistic. Operational orders emphasized maintaining momentum and preventing Soviet forces from withdrawing into the Kiev defensive zone. Infantry divisions received instructions to secure captured towns, clear forests, and marsh areas of Soviet detachments, and establish blocking positions along major roads. Soviet leadership attempted to restore order by dispatching additional reserves. The 19th and 21st Rifle Corps were redirected toward Kiev to strengthen the defensive belt. The Southwestern Front headquarters relocated several times to maintain communication with subordinate armies. However, the volume of conflicting reports, combined with the loss of telephone lines and radio stations, delayed critical decisions. Some Soviet divisions received withdrawal orders only after German units had already reached their flanks or rear positions. In mid-July, the German capture of Bila Tserkva and Fastiv deepened the crisis. These towns offered control over routes leading toward the Dnipro crossings south of Kiev. Their loss compressed the Soviet defensive zone and increased pressure on the 26th Army, which now faced a narrowing corridor through which to retreat. German forces approaching the outskirts of Kiev further destabilized the situation, forcing the Soviet command to allocate troops primarily for city defense rather than for broader maneuver operations. By the end of the campaign's peak phase, the Red Army found itself struggling to maintain coherent defensive structures across a front more than 300 kilometers wide. German armored thrusts had reached operational depths that threatened to isolate large Soviet groupings. Although Soviet troops continued to resist in multiple sectors, the increasing convergence of German forces toward the Dnipro made the prospect of a large-scale encirclement ever more likely. The stage was set for the next series of operations that would determine the fate of several Soviet armies trapped west of Kiev. Soviet forces entered a phase of adaptation marked by improvised defensive actions, localized counterattacks, and attempts to restore command cohesion during the second half of July 1941. As German formations pushed deeper toward the Dnipro and narrowed the operational space available to the southwestern front, Soviet armies relied increasingly on fragmented units, remnants of mechanized corps, and hastily mobilized reserves from central and eastern Ukraine. These efforts aimed to delay the German advance long enough to allow an organized withdrawal toward Kiev and the River Line, yet the pace of the campaign often outstripped the ability of Soviet command to reposition forces effectively. The Fifth Army played a crucial role in shaping resistance north of Kiev. Positioned along the Korostin fortified region, its divisions occupied pre-war defensive structures consisting of concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and interconnected trenches. Although many fortifications lacked artillery, the terrain offered natural advantages. Forest belts and marsh areas limited German armored maneuver, compelling the Wehrmacht to commit infantry units to dislodge Soviet defenders. Several Soviet rifle divisions held their positions for extended periods, forcing German forces to redirect panzer divisions southward rather than risk prolonged attrition. This resistance slowed operational tempo, but increasing pressure on the Army's flanks gradually eroded its ability to maintain a continuous line. Further south, The 6th and 26th Armies attempted to coordinate defensive fronts from Berdichev toward Fastiv and Bila Tserkva. These armies had suffered heavy losses during earlier engagements and now relied on reorganized regiments formed from retreating troops, security units, and logistical personnel. Artillery shortages affected their ability to conduct sustained fire missions, and many divisions operated with fewer than half their authorized guns. Commanders compensated by concentrating remaining artillery into small but dense batteries to cover likely German approach routes. While this created local defensive strength, it left large sectors thinly defended. Partisan activity began to emerge behind German lines, although it remained limited in its early stages. Small Soviet detachments cut communication wires, ambushed reconnaissance patrols, and reported German troop movements to the front command. However, the rapid advance of German forces and the instability of front lines restricted the formation of larger partisan groups. Most resistance took the form of isolated actions by stragglers or by NKVD border detachments that continued to operate in wooded areas after being cut off. Adaptation also occurred within Soviet armored forces. Surviving T-34s and KV-1s were increasingly grouped into small mobile detachments tasked with counterattacking German spearheads, delaying their progress, or covering the withdrawal of rifle units. These ad hoc formations sometimes achieved tactical results by forcing German columns to halt and reorganize. Nevertheless, mechanical reliability issues, diminishing ammunition supplies, and the absence of comprehensive repair facilities limited their long-term effectiveness. Crews cannibalized damaged vehicles to maintain a small operational core, but the overall number of serviceable tanks continued to decline. Resource management became a decisive factor in the Soviet effort. Railroads leading into Kiev were used to transport replacement units, artillery, and ammunition, though frequent Luftwaffe attacks disrupted schedules. Fuel depots east of the Dnipro attempted to support frontline units through improvised truck convoys, but many shipments failed to reach their destinations due to road congestion and shifting front lines. Field kitchens, medical services, and logistics units operated under constant strain, reducing the ability of Soviet troops to sustain prolonged operations. Psychological pressures intensified. Many Soviet soldiers had been fighting continuously for weeks, often without adequate rest or shelter. Reports noted declining unit cohesion in depleted formations, while newly arrived conscripts required rapid integration into frontline units. Nonetheless, Soviet propaganda emphasized the strategic significance of Kiev and the necessity of preventing its encirclement. This messaging reinforced determination among troops and local populations. Even as the operational situation grew more precarious, German forces faced their own challenges. The expanding depth of the front complicated supply delivery, especially as armored divisions approached the Dnipro line. Repair units struggled to keep vehicles operational after weeks of continuous movement. Infantry divisions following the Panzer Group encountered strong points that demanded prolonged clearing operations, slowing the overall advance. These delays offered the Red Army small windows to reorganize defensive positions or withdraw endangered divisions. Despite localized Soviet successes in delaying German movements, the structural situation continued to deteriorate. German units advancing from the west and southwest gradually compressed the Soviet defensive zone. The capture of Bila Tserkva and continued pressure toward Fastiv reduced the distance between the northern and southern German thrusts, increasing the likelihood that remaining Soviet armies would be isolated if withdrawals were not executed in time. The Southwestern Front attempted to preserve mobility and maintain open corridors to the Dnipro, but the convergence of German operations increasingly limited available options. By the end of July, Soviet resistance and adaptation had prevented an immediate collapse, yet the combination of attrition, fragmented command, and expanding German control over key transportation routes left multiple armies vulnerable. The stage was set for a critical turning point, as German forces prepared to close the encirclement on Soviet formations west of Kiev. By early August 1941, the Southwestern Front faced a decisive turning point as German operations aimed to complete the encirclement of Soviet forces positioned west of the Dnipro. The 1st Panzer Group, having advanced along the Kiev-Bila Tserkva axis, now pushed northeast toward the town of Bohuslav and the approaches to Kiev. At the same time, the 17th Army and Romanian formations advanced from Vinnytsia and Uman, tightening the ring around the Soviet 6th and 12th Armies. This convergence of forces created the conditions for one of the earliest large encirclements on the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The Soviet 6th and 12th Armies attempted to withdraw toward the Plyashivka and Sinyuka rivers after suffering weeks of attrition. However, their retreat routes became increasingly congested as multiple divisions converged on limited road networks. Units moving eastward encountered destroyed bridges, abandoned equipment, and civilian refugee columns. Many regiments lacked clear information about German positions due to disrupted communications. Attempts to coordinate withdrawals were further complicated by rapid changes in the front line, with reports often arriving several hours after conditions had already shifted. German forces exploited their operational advantage by seizing key river crossings ahead of Soviet troops. Elements of the 16th and 11th Panzer Divisions crossed the Hersky-Tikich River and established blocking positions east of Uman. Meanwhile, infantry divisions of the 17th Army advanced methodically from the southwest, creating a tightening semicircle. By 2 to 3 August, German units had effectively sealed the main escape routes, forming a pocket that contained more than 100,000 Soviet personnel from the 6th and 12th Armies, along with remnants of mechanized corps and supporting units. Inside the encirclement, Soviet commanders attempted to regroup. The pocket stretched across forested areas and rolling agricultural terrain, offering limited defensive advantages. Ammunition stocks dwindled rapidly, and fuel shortages immobilized remaining armored vehicles. Artillery units often fired their last available shells within the first days of encirclement. Command posts relocated repeatedly to avoid artillery fire, while medical stations faced overwhelming numbers of wounded. Communication with the Southwestern Front headquarters became sporadic, leaving commanders to operate with minimal guidance. Several breakout attempts were organized. On 5 to 6 August, combined detachments from infantry and tank units attempted to reach German lines near Nova Bud, committing hundreds of soldiers in concentrated assaults. While some Soviet groups penetrated the first line of German defenses, counterattacks by German infantry and airstrikes halted further progress. Similar attempts near Ternivka and Kopenkivka encountered the same outcome: brief tactical successes followed by the rapid re-establishment of German blocking positions. The Luftwaffe maintained consistent pressure, targeting Soviet concentrations and preventing large-scale regrouping. Civilians within the encircled region experienced severe hardship. Villages caught between converging forces were subjected to artillery exchanges, destruction of infrastructure, and shortages of food and water. Many residents attempted to flee eastward, but were unable to pass German lines or cross destroyed bridges. Agricultural fields became battlegrounds, and livestock was often slaughtered to feed encircled troops. Health conditions deteriorated as medical supplies were exhausted, and temporary field hospitals struggled to manage the influx of casualties. German command viewed the tightening pocket as an opportunity to neutralize a significant portion of the southwestern front. Infantry divisions were instructed to maintain continuous pressure along the perimeter, slowly compressing the Soviet forces into a smaller area. Artillery units conducted systematic bombardments, targeting assembly points and suspected command posts. The objective was not only to prevent breakout attempts, but also to reduce the Soviet capacity for organized resistance within the pocket. Soviet troops inside the encirclement faced increasing fragmentation. Units that had entered the pocket as divisions often became reduced to battalion-sized groups. Commanders improvised defensive lines along ridges and forest belts, attempting to slow the German advance and regroup for further breakout attempts. However, the disparity in supply levels, the exhaustion of personnel, and the constant pressure from German forces diminished their ability to hold sustained defensive positions. Many formations lacked functioning radios and relied on runners to transmit orders across hazardous terrain. The collapse of the pocket accelerated between 7 and 8 August as German infantry and armor reduced the remaining defensive perimeter. Isolated Soviet groups continued to resist, but the lack of ammunition and coordinated leadership made organized operations increasingly difficult. Smaller detachments attempted to break out in scattered directions, with some managing to reach Soviet lines east of the Sinyuka River. Most, however, were forced back or overwhelmed. By the end of this turning point phase, the encirclement west of Uman had effectively resulted in the destruction or capture of large Soviet forces. The failure to withdraw earlier, combined with rapid German maneuvers and persistent air pressure, created conditions in which Soviet armies could not maintain operational integrity. The consequences of this encirclement would shape the next stage of the campaign as the focus shifted toward the broader struggle for Kiev and the Dnipro line. The destruction of the 6th and 12th armies at Uman marked only the first stage of the wider crisis unfolding along the southwestern front. In mid-August 1941, as German forces consolidated control over the southern sector, the operational focus shifted northward toward the larger Soviet groupings positioned around Kiev. While the Red Army attempted to establish a stable defensive line along the Dnipro and the Desna rivers, German command prepared a new maneuver that aimed to encircle several Soviet armies by cutting their communications with the east. This development, lasting from mid-August to early September, became the critical turning point that defined the fate of the Kiev defensive region. The Soviet 5th, 26th, 37th, and 38th armies held positions west of the Dnipro, forming a broad arc around Kiev. Their combined strength numbered several 100,000 personnel, but many divisions were depleted from earlier fighting. Rifle divisions commonly fielded 4,000, 6,000 men instead of their pre-war complements of 12,000. Artillery stocks varied widely. Some units maintained functional batteries, while others possessed only a portion of their authorized guns. Despite these limitations, the Stavka ordered the southwestern front to retain its positions west of the river, viewing Kiev as a politically and strategically essential strongpoint whose loss would undermine national morale. German operations to initiate the encirclement began with a breakthrough by the 2nd Panzer Group under Heinz Guderian. Redirected southward after operations near Smolensk, Guderian's armored forces advanced through the region of Hlukiv and Konotop, targeting the Desna crossings. Their objective was to penetrate the left flank of the southwestern front and establish contact with the 1st Panzer Group advancing from the southwest. This maneuver, if successful, would trap multiple Soviet armies between two converging armored thrusts. Soviet command recognized the danger of the German redirection only gradually. Communication difficulties between fronts increased uncertainty about the scale and direction of the panic thrust. Reports from the Bryansk front indicated rapid advances by German units into the Desna region, but inconsistent information led to delays in issuing withdrawal orders. The southwestern front continued to prioritize defense of Kiev, redirecting reserves primarily to the city's fortifications rather than to threatened sectors farther north. By late August, German forces pushed deeper toward Lokvitsia and Romny. This advance threatened the main supply and retreat routes of the 5th and 37th armies. Soviet attempts to halt the penetration involved deploying recently mobilized rifle divisions and remnants of tank brigades. Although these units conducted determined counterattacks, often involving small groups of surviving T-34s and KV-1s, their efforts slowed but did not stop the advance. German armored units, supported by motorized infantry and consistent air reconnaissance, maintained the initiative. On the southern axis, the 1st Panzer Group advanced northward from Kirovohrad toward the Sel and Sula rivers. Infantry divisions of the 17th Army followed closely, ensuring that German flanks remained protected as armored units pushed toward potential link-up points with Guderian's spearheads. Soviet forces in this region attempted to stabilize defensive positions near Lubny and Mirhorod, but the rapid approach of German vanguards created growing confusion. Units attempting to retreat eastward found themselves funneled into narrow corridors, where Luftwaffe attacks inflicted significant casualties and destroyed transport columns. Political and command considerations further complicated the Soviet response. The Stavka remained divided over whether to authorize a full withdrawal from Kiev. Some leaders emphasized the strategic necessity of preserving manpower and preventing the encirclement of entire armies, while others argued that abandoning the capital would have severe psychological and political consequences. As discussions continued, German armored forces moved closer to completing the encirclement. By the first days of September, German spearheads from the 2nd Panzer Group and the 1st Panzer Group had advanced to within approximately 40 kilometers of each other. The narrowing gap left Soviet armies with only a single corridor eastward, and this route continued to shrink. Attempts by the Southwestern Front to organize a coordinated withdrawal faced major obstacles: disrupted rail transportation, destroyed bridges, and constant air pressure. Some divisions began withdrawing without explicit orders, while others remained fixed in place due to outdated or contradictory directives. Civilian populations across the region faced increasing hardship. Cities such as Nizhyn, Priluki, and Pyryatyn experienced shortages of food, water, and medical supplies as front lines approached. Evacuation efforts progressed slowly, with many trains overcrowded or forced to reroute due to destroyed tracks. Rural populations saw their agricultural resources requisitioned by both sides, with many villages suffering damage from artillery exchanges and passing armored columns. By early September, the encirclement became imminent. German forces captured key crossings along the Sula River and pressed toward Lokvitsia, while additional infantry divisions extended the perimeter southward. Soviet efforts to open the corridor through counterattacks with available reserves achieved only temporary local gains and could not reverse the broader strategic situation. The Southwestern Front now faced the consequences of delayed withdrawals and diverging strategic priorities. The turning point was reached when German vanguards linked up east of Lokvitsia, closing the encirclement around the 5th, 37th, 26th, and 38th Armies. This operational collapse set the stage for the final reduction of the pocket, which would define the next phase of the campaign and determine the scale of losses suffered by the Red Army west of Kiev. Following the closure of the encirclement east of Lokvitsia in early September 1941, the Soviet armies trapped west of the Dnipro entered their final phase of organized resistance. The pocket contained large elements of the 5th, 26th, 37th, and 38th Armies, along with support units, rear services, and significant numbers of civilians who had been unable to evacuate in time. Estimates indicate that more than 400,000 Soviet personnel were caught within the encirclement, though the precise figure varied as units fragmented and mixed during retreat. The German command sought to eliminate the pocket through coordinated pressure by both armored and infantry formations, while preventing any large-scale breakout attempts that might disrupt the broader strategic plan to advance further into eastern Ukraine. Soviet forces inside the pocket attempted to form new defensive lines using available terrain features such as riverbanks, forest belts, and elevated ridges. However, the loss of artillery, ammunition shortages, and the destruction of command posts severely limited the ability to organize coherent defenses. Many divisions had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Rifle regiments that once numbered 2,000, 3,000 men now fielded a few hundred. Communications across the pocket were sporadic, with only short-range radios and courier routes available. Attempts to re-establish contact with the Southwestern Front headquarters resulted in incomplete or delayed transmission of orders, reinforcing operational confusion. Breakout attempts occurred almost daily. Between 10 and 15 September, several Soviet groupings attempted to reach the east bank of the Sula and Sel rivers. These efforts typically involved concentrated night movements, followed by rapid assaults on German blocking positions. While some detachments managed to cross small gaps in the encirclement, the majority encountered well-prepared defenses supported by artillery and air reconnaissance. Luftwaffe aircraft, particularly reconnaissance units operating in clear weather, quickly detected Soviet concentrations, allowing German infantry and motorized units to reinforce threatened sectors. As a result, most breakout attempts dissolved into fragmented engagements, leaving many wounded and captured. German efforts to reduce the pocket unfolded gradually. Infantry divisions tightened the encirclement perimeter, advancing toward key towns such as Romny, Lokvitsia, and Pyryatyn. Artillery units conducted systematic bombardments aimed at disrupting Soviet regrouping and degrading remaining defensive strongpoints. Armored units, having achieved their main operational objectives, were used selectively to exploit weaknesses in Soviet lines or to intercept retreating columns. German forces also captured substantial amounts of abandoned Soviet equipment, including artillery pieces, vehicles, and aircraft left behind at improvised airfields. Soviet medical and logistical conditions deteriorated rapidly. Field hospitals lacked essential supplies such as bandages, antiseptics, and painkillers. Many wounded soldiers had to be moved on makeshift carts or carried by stretcher bearers across rough terrain. Food supplies dwindled, with some units relying on foraged crops or livestock taken from abandoned villages. Water shortages became acute in areas subjected to heavy shelling, where wells were destroyed or contaminated. The inability to evacuate seriously wounded personnel contributed to rising mortality. Civilians within the pocket bore severe hardships. Towns and villages suffered damage from artillery exchanges and passing armored columns. Many residents attempted to flee towards Soviet lines, but shifting front lines and destroyed infrastructure impeded movement. In several locations, local populations provided assistance to Soviet soldiers by offering shelter or distributing limited food supplies, but these efforts were constrained by shortages and the risk of German reprisals. After the pocket collapsed, German occupation authorities began systematic registration of civilians and requisitioning of agricultural resources. By mid-September, the perimeter of the encirclement contracted substantially. German infantry forces reached the central areas of the pocket, encountering scattered Soviet resistance. The immediate aftermath of the encirclement reshaped the strategic situation in Ukraine. The destruction of 4 Soviet armies deprived the Red Army of a substantial portion of its trained personnel, artillery, and armored vehicles in the southwestern theater. German forces gained control of key transportation routes and river crossings, facilitating their subsequent advance toward Kharkiv and the Donbass. The fall of Kiev, which followed weeks later, further consolidated German regional dominance. In the broader context of the war, the Kiev encirclement became one of the most significant early war defeats suffered by the Red Army. Its scale influenced Soviet strategic planning, prompting the development of deeper defensive lines and new operational doctrines designed to prevent similar encirclements in later stages of the conflict.